She cries just as much when she's completely happy as she does when she's utterly devastated. She likes to think it's enough to water wildflower meadows. They may call her pathetic, they may call her dramatic, they may call her a baby, but she thinks it's a blessing to feel everything so much. Goddess of Spring. So, this is the first poem in Amanda Lovelace's collection, Flower Crowns and Fearsome Things. If you're unfamiliar, Lovelace is an insta-poet who rose to fame in much the same way as her contemporaries. She's probably most well known for her collection titled The Princess Saves Herself in This One. That book is actually part of a series, and while I imagine the continuity in each book is not all that relevant to being able to pick one up, I decided to take a look at a collection that isn't part of a series so I could have the complete experience. Going back to our first poem here, I'm sure you see all the hallmarks of insta-poetry: brief, digestible lines, designed to be easily shared and reposted. And if you know me, you know I don't exactly get down with insta-poetry, but something rather interesting happened with this piece. Maybe it was the fact that I was just coming off the back of Atticus's collection, LVOE, and so anything was going to sound good to me at this point, but this first poem in the collection actually did strike me in a certain way. Don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying the poem is good, but it gets at something personal to me. I have been called overly sensitive, so I can relate to the sentiment in this piece. But that probably sounds counterintuitive. How can that be? How can it be that the poem strikes me in a certain way, but I still don't like it? Well, I'm sure you all can follow my logic on this one, but there's a difference between something being relatable and truly striking a chord with you. There's no actual moment of connection here, and that's because the subject matter is too generic, much like Atticus. The poem doesn't ground me. I feel too detached from it. I hope this isn't too mean, but Lovelace's poem here affects me in the same way that one of those admit it memes affects me. Like, yes, I have experienced this, but it leaves no deeper impression and I ultimately move on. If there were some specific encounter in this poem, that would ironically make it more relatable, more graspable, even if it weren't an encounter I myself had literally experienced. Currently, the subject of the poem doesn't feel human because she's so underdescribed and underdeveloped. I hope this makes sense. I feel like I'm contradicting myself. Here, let me show you some counterexamples. Here are some poems that I don't literally relate to, but that feel more human. Citizen, an American lyric by Claudia Rankine, almost immediately comes to mind. Here is the piece from page 13 of that book. A woman you do not know wants to join you for lunch. You are visiting her campus. In the cafe, you both order the Caesar salad. This overlap is not the beginning of anything because she immediately points out that she, her father, her grandfather, and you all attended the same college. She wanted her son to go there as well, but because of affirmative action or minority something, she is not sure what they are calling it these days, and weren't they supposed to get rid of it? Her son wasn't accepted. You are not sure if you are meant to apologize for this failure of your alma mater's legacy program. Instead, you ask where he ended up. The prestigious school she mentions doesn't seem to assuage her irritation. This exchange, in effect, ends your lunch. The salads arrive. To me, this is an effective demonstration of a poem that's both blunt and human. Rather than merely telling us broadly that they have experienced racism, the speaker of the poem sheds light on a specific instance of racism they've experienced. Citizen is full of moments like this, all show and no tell. And like I said, I can't relate to the speaker's position in the poem, and I've certainly never done what the other woman in this poem does, but the piece does cause reflection in me. Have I ever perpetrated a microaggression such as this without even thinking about it? In general, have I treated non-white people with blame or aggression? And what do all these experiences in Rankine's book say about the broader culture and systems in which I live? They help me understand a bit better what it's like to be black in America. In my diversity in American literature class, my professor told us that some people were upset when they found out some of the experiences written in Citizen were fictionalized. While I can partially understand their ire, that's not exactly the point of poetry. This might seem like a weird comparison, but consider the book of Job in the Bible for a moment. Even people who believe in the Bible as a work of nonfiction have conflicting opinions about Job's veracity. Like, the book opens with Satan entering heaven and basically challenging God. I have a feeling a lot of theologians would have a problem with that depiction, and a lot of Bible scholars will admit that the Book of Job is not a true account, but a fictional poem. But whether you believe the Bible is a historically true document or not, ask yourself, does the Book of Job have any less literary merit if it's false? I would argue no, just in the same way that the works of Shakespeare or Homer don't have any less literary merit, despite their fictionalized elements and mythologies. Granted, it can be hard to separate the historical significance from the literary significance, and frankly, we shouldn't separate those things, I don't think. The question of fiction and truth reminds me of this bit from Wake Up Dead Man.
Do these stories convince us of a lie? Or do they resonate with something deep inside us that's profoundly true?
In the case of Citizen, and all poetry for that matter, the work doesn't have value based on how literally true or autobiographical it is. The work has value because it gets at something real and human. Let's take a look at another example. This is The Toad by Juan Jose Arreola, translated by W.S. Merwin. Every so often he jumps, just to make it clear that he is essentially immobile. The jump is in some way like a heartbeat. Careful observation makes it plain that the whole of the toad is a heart. Clamped in a hunk of cold mud, the toad sinks into the winter like a mournful chrysalis. He wakes in the spring knowing that he has not changed into anything else. Dried to his depths, he is more a toad than ever. He waits in silence for the first rains. And one fine day he heaves himself out of the pliant earth, heavy with moisture, swollen with spiteful sap, like a heart tossed onto the ground. In his sphinx-like posture there is a secret proposition of exchange, and the toad's ugliness appalls us like a mirror. So in certain ways, this poem isn't relatable to me at all because I think toads are cute. In fact, that seems to be the consensus these days. The people love frogs and toads. We can't get enough of the frogs and toads, isn't that right, folks? But that's what makes the poem's ending so effective. We understand that the speaker only has so much hatred for the toad because they see themselves in the toad. It appalls them like a mirror. In that case, the line, "He wakes in the spring knowing that he has not changed," is particularly relatable to me. I feel like I go through long periods where I have made no meaningful change in my life. And that's not true, but it's a very human feeling, isn't it? And how interesting that the speaker says, "The whole of the toad is a heart," then later describes the toad like a heart tossed onto the ground. How dejected must the speaker feel? How unmoving, stagnant, unwanted, discarded, these are very human emotions, communicated in a poem that on its face doesn't seem relatable at all, and takes a non-human entity as its subject. It's fascinating work. But in Lovelace's case, the poems feel oppositely impactful. They are relatable on their face, but they don't actually pierce a reader's heart. This is a recurring phenomenon throughout the book, and we're going to talk about it more later. Hey, but real quick, are you sick of AI assistants popping up in your writing software? Not to mention the fact that most famous word processors out there are probably using your writing to train AI. If so, you should use the sponsor of today's video, Ellipsis, a free word processor made by writers for writers. Viewers of my channel will know that Ellipsis is like the only sponsor I even accept these days, and that's because I truly believe in their mission. Writer identity and individuality is so important these days, what with corporations trying to replace writers. Ellipsis will not sell your data, nor will they use your writing to train any LLM. They genuinely care about your privacy. On top of that, Ellipsis has a monthly newsletter, human-made templates for your inspiration, and a community Discord where you can find collaborators and accountability partners. Ellipsis makes it easier than ever to comment on your friend's work. In a time when human-to-human connection is so important, the spirit of collaboration is alive and well with Ellipsis. You can use the QR code on screen or my link in the description or pinned comment, ellipsis.app/rd, to start using Ellipsis today completely for free. Thanks so much to Ellipsis for sponsoring this video. Now, back to it. Before moving on, let's talk a little bit more about this book. So this is ostensibly a book about Persephone, but you wouldn't quite know it by looking at the cover, nor even by reading a lot of the poems. Before the poems begin, we have this note from the author, which reads, "There is a beloved goddess from Greek mythology you may or may not be familiar with. Her name is Persephone. She's fascinating for an endless list of reasons, including the fact that she's considered to be both the goddess of spring as well as the queen of the underworld, making her quite the complicated woman in my humble opinion." So, sorry, I don't mean to be too mean with this video, but I find this passage kind of ironic. It's true that Persephone is fascinating for an endless number of reasons, but I feel like this book is barely scratching the surface. The book presents what I find to be a pretty shallow reading of Persephone, and as the poems go on, it seems to me that they become less about the goddess and more about Lovelace herself or other women of this day and age. It's obviously more than fine to take Persephone and compare her situation to women in the modern day, but few of the poems truly seem like they could stand for Persephone at all. And we'll continue talking about this as we go on. As I've touched on already, Lovelace's work is often just too didactic. And while poems shouldn't be riddles, when a writer is so in your face about their points, that heavy-handedness ironically undermines the intention. That's one of my problems with some repetition in poetry. It does too much hammering home. And put a pin in that for a second. After the author's note, we get this little poem before the pages are numbered. Who said you can't wear a flower crown and still remain a fearsome thing? Make Persephone proud. This poem is unintentionally hilarious to me because it reminds me of that meme that's like, and they say girls with brown hair can't wear jeans. That said, I don't hate the conceit of this poem. I think subverting the idea of a peace-loving woman who wears a flower crown isn't a bad idea. The execution just leaves a lot to be desired. The image of the flower crown is just contrasted with the idea of fearsomeness, and that's kind of underwhelming. Like, why not use another image? For example, a flower crown on the head and a mace in the hands, just as an example, and assuming a mace would adhere to Lovelace's idea of fearsome. But that's another problem in and of itself. The word fearsome is so nebulous as opposed to the concrete image of the flower crown. Okay, so with all that introductory material in mind, here is the second numbered poem in the collection. She has always sparked more fear than lust in the hearts of men. She doesn't need their chocolate, she doesn't need their diamonds, she doesn't need their money. All of those things she can give to herself. When he sent her roses, she burned them all, and then planted her own, and they were all the more lovely for it. Queen of the underworld. So let me put this next to our first poem, and we basically have the gimmick of the book here. One page will represent Persephone as the goddess of spring, while the next page will represent her as the goddess of the underworld, more or less. I say more or less because a lot of the poems don't really feel like pairs at all, so in some ways it feels like the book doesn't even deliver on its own premise. And as I've already mentioned, the Persephone theme feels tenuous at best in many poems, if present at all. I don't think it's even a bad thing for a poetry book to have a gimmick per se, but I think the poet has to go all in if that's what they decide. Getting back to the actual text of the poem, it's impossible to not notice Lovelace's reliance on repetition in both of the opening poems. What's more, and you can call this nitpicking if you want, but I would say diamonds and money feel similar symbolically, which makes the repetition all the weaker. On the flip side, I don't hate the last stanza. This, in my opinion, should have been the whole poem. Like, not just these 4 lines, but this premise, an expansion of these 4 lines. Build on this imagery and peel back the layers. What does it look, sound, smell, and feel like to burn the roses? What does it feel like to plant the new ones? What do those views and experiences reveal to us about the poem's subject? Lovelace's poems never take a moment to indulge in their imagery or symbolism. As I said, all tell and no show. Here's another poem that's got an okay concept with a poor execution. If every other girl is Queen Anne's lace, then I'm poison hemlock. At first glance, we look exactly the same, until someone gets too close, and they realize I'm not worth the trouble. Sigh. Like I said, okay concept, poor execution. As with the poem about burning the roses, a more successful version of this poem might delve into the distinction between Queen Anne's lace and hemlock. But there's another thing I want to talk about here, something that Lovelace generally does a lot better than Atticus, that being titles. The title of this piece could be doing a lot more, in my opinion, but if we go back to poems 1 and 2, these were decently successful titles, as they added that much more context to our reading. Without these titles, I probably wouldn't have realized these poems were about Persephone, or at least alluding to her. If you'll recall, Atticus's poems had no titles at all and thus missed out on a major opportunity to provide more for the reader. Lovelace's titles don't always hit, but they aren't strictly terrible. She seems to know what a title can do for a poem, even if the execution isn't 100% there. Let's continue with this idea of concept versus execution. Consider this piece. They know her as the girl who sees signs in everything. At her core, she knows that the dragonflies are probably just dragonflies, and the songbirds are probably just songbirds, not guardian angels in disguise, not departed loved ones delivering messages of comfort and reassurance. But if you think that will ever stop her, then you'd be horribly mistaken, for experience has taught her that the faith in miracles is more important than the presence of them. After all, that's often what creates them in the first place. Hope is essential. This piece is unique for Lovelace in that it's a prose poem, one of only two in this collection. The problem, though, is that the poem's progression feels off. Lovelace should have shown us examples of the signs the subject sees before revealing that she knows there's no true grandeur, and after that reveal, an example of how faith creates miracles would have been appreciated too. The dragonflies and songbirds are okay inclusions, but again, they would have been all the better with some counterexamples, as well as maybe some greater imagery or depth in some other fashion. Much later in the book, we have this piece. Covering you with a blanket when you're cold, lightly running fingertips over your scalp, bringing you your favorite pancakes in bed, folding your clothes without being asked to, surprising you with perfectly made coffee. How she shows her love without words. This one is so close to getting somewhere, it's nearly all showing, so I should love it, right? The problem is that most of these examples of showing love are just so non-unique. If we think back to Claudia Rankine's poem from Citizen, there are a lot of unique details to this piece that really set it apart. The fact that the woman is a stranger to the speaker, the location of her campus, the Caesar salad. These are fascinating and unique expository details that make the piece feel that much more real. The details Lovelace uses in their poem here are too generic, which was the same problem with Atticus's work. Almost anyone who's in a relationship could slot themselves into this poem, which kind of undermines its message because it would suggest that this relationship isn't all that special. It's just your run-of-the-mill relationship fare. Sorry if that's harsh. It just disappoints me that I don't actually have much insight into this relationship despite reading a whole poem about it. It's like, what did I actually gain from this poem? What has it taught me about humanity that I didn't already know before? Again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be harsh. Here's another piece that's almost getting somewhere. I see your wandering eye, I see your hypocrisy. I see the way you look away from me to look at her like she's an otherworldly phenomenon, a nymph you can't resist. It makes me want to wither where I stand, and my mother taught me to be an annual, never a perennial. Once I leave, I won't be coming back. Oh man, I haven't even mentioned the unnecessary italics in this book yet, but that's not actually what I want to touch on. Like I said, this poem is almost getting somewhere, particularly at the end. I'm not a gardener, and I'm also a little dummy, so I didn't know what Lovelace meant by annual and perennial. I had to look it up. As Scotts explains, annual flowers grow for one long season, often into the fall, then die with the onset of freezing weather. Perennials come back year after year, with some plants that live just a couple years and others that continue growing for decades. Ergo, in this poem, the speaker is saying that their mother taught them when they leave a man to leave for good and never come back. I think that's a fine metaphor, honestly, but as with many decent features in Lovelace's work, it's just so underdeveloped. Like the Burning Roses, it would have been more interesting to dig more into this annual-perennial dichotomy instead of focusing on all this in-your-face text about the unsteady partner. And based on the title, it seems the poem is more about the leaving, so I feel the poem itself should be more about that too, and less about the partner and this other woman. And with that in mind, I want to show one more poem that I think ironically and unfortunately demonstrates the faults in execution across the board here. Why is it that we're always the damsels in distress? Write more difficult women. Write more angry women. Write more unlikable women. Write more cunning women. Write more women who revel in their wickedness. Show our complexity. So I call this piece ironic because, well, I feel Lovelace doesn't paint a very complex picture of the women presented in this collection. Part of the issue, and I've already touched on it, is Lovelace's didactic style. People in real life never tell you exactly who they are, so why should poetry? And with that in mind, I want to shift gears a little bit and get into Lovelace's more heavy-handed pieces. Consider this one. I refuse to be ashamed of taking up my rightful space. I refuse to apologize for daring to have an opinion. It's a pleasure to disappoint you. So here's the deal. I don't even disagree with this sentiment. I don't think this should be a controversial statement, but women should obviously have the right to speak, take up space, share their opinions, etc. I know, hold your applause. But Lovelace is not the first person to make this point either, and her delivery here is not that new or unique or interesting. Like, again, I feel this poem would have been so much better if Lovelace could have provided examples of ways they, or people like them, have been silenced. And as with Rankine, they wouldn't even have to be lived experiences to be real. Here's another example. Don't you think it's funny how bad boys are always deemed swoon-worthy while bad girls are usually perceived as a threat to society? Don't tell me sexism isn't real. Again, I agree with the sentiment, sexism is absolutely real. Hey, I said hold your applause, cut that out. But is this really the evidence you want to couple with the poem's titular assertion? Some more expansion in the second stanza would be appreciated. What does it actually mean for girls to be bad girls? What is Lovelace's conception of a bad girl? But also, may I just say, I'm not actually sure the logic holds up. Like, sure, in some circles and to some people, bad boys are swoon-worthy, and culturally there certainly is the bad boy archetype that is deemed desirable, but I'm not sure it's as universal as this poem would suggest. A lot of people have the sense to say bad boys are not good for women or for society, no? And isn't the bad girl archetype also desirable on a large scale? Maybe my perception is skewed here, and please tell me if it is. To that point, there was another poem that used the phrases "my body, my choice" and "my bedroom, my business," and again, those are sentiments I agree with, but I have a hard time believing that poems which deliver their messages so bluntly would be taken seriously, especially by detractors of women's rights. If the goal of the poem is just to net someone who agrees with you, then I suppose such poems could achieve that goal. But if the goal is to change people's minds, I really don't think there's enough there. That said, look at me. I'm like the least marginalized person in the world, and I'm not a woman. If anything I've said is out of line here, I invite and encourage you to please correct me. But while we're still on the subject of heavy-handedness, there are 4 separate poems that are all basically about not holding a grudge, or letting go of the need for revenge, or something to that effect. Personally, I feel like there are diminishing returns when you repeat big ideas in such blunt terms. The more you try to convince me as a reader that you have no ill will toward anyone, the more I'm going to find that repetition suspicious. Hey, repetition, suspicion, that's a pretty good rhyme. Anyhow, those are my major thoughts on the collection. I just want to slot in one more thing before my conclusion here. I mentioned how there's this purported duality in the collection, where one poem will be from the goddess of spring's perspective, while the other poem will be from the perspective of the goddess of the underworld, ostensibly at least. So to complement each of these contrasts, there's an illustration of either a flower meadow or a bunch of roses on fire. I like these illustrations, but they literally pop up every other page. I thought there would be, like, at least some kind of progression, like the meadow would grow a little taller with each page, or the fire would grow larger with each page until the roses were reduced to ash, but no, it's the same 2 illustrations the whole way through. I've talked about this before on the channel, but so many collections just feel artificially inflated in their page length, and this is no exception. I don't dislike these pieces of art, but I did find myself getting annoyed with their repetition, which I suppose is unsurprising coming from me. Anyhow, here is my conclusion. Based on what I read in this book, I'm positive that Lovelace does have experiences that would make for good poems. Everyone does. And Lovelace keeps hinting at them, but never fully divulging them. Like, on page 19, she alludes to the idea of a girl being one of the guys. That idea alone would make for a good poem, especially when coupled with an experience, whether real or invented. But as it stands, a brief line in this very generic poem, it just kind of amounts to nothing, I'm sorry to say. Granted, as opposed to Atticus's work, Lovelace's poems at least feel sincere. That doesn't make them good, but it seems to me that Lovelace at least has a point to her poetry. She's not writing it cynically or only with the intention of making money. I think there's something else in it for her. And if Lovelace's work gets more people into poetry as a medium, awesome. That's seriously great. I do hope, though, that if Lovelace is still writing and publishing, she might take some more time with her pieces, home in on what makes them interesting, and show us more in that regard. Before we wrap up here, I just wanted to mention Persephone the Wanderer by Louise Glick. It's a little long for me to read, but it's an incredible poem that begins with the tone of an essay before gradually shifting to be more and more poetic. It gets at a lot of big ideas Lovelace is trying to tackle, but in such a profound way. Because of the essay tone, it starts out feeling kind of didactic, but it becomes more contemplative and allegorical as it goes on. It's amazing. But what do you think? Are you a fan of Lovelace's work? Did you like any of the poems presented here? Did you think I was off the mark in any way? If so, please tell me everything. If you like what I do here and want to support, consider donating to me on Patreon. For just $3 a month, you can see videos early, hear about the books I'm reading each month, and join the community Discord. We do open mics and prompts in there. It's a lot of fun. Our first prompt of May was to write a poem with the theme of backwards, whether a palindrome, a reverse narrative, or a reversed version of an existing text. It was a lot of fun. You're seeing my patrons' names on screen right now, and I truly can't thank them enough. They make this all possible. To support the channel in other important ways, please do all the things the algorithm likes: liking, commenting, subscribing, hyping, lighting roses on fire, that sort of thing. You can follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around till the end of the video, have a writing prompt. Today, I want you to consider the Persephone myth for yourself and write about it. In what ways do you identify with Persephone, if any? What experiences do you have that you think tie you to Persephone? In fact, you could even frame the piece as a conversation between you and Persephone. In that conversation, what would you want to tell her? What do you think she would want to know about you? The time is yours now. Get to writing.